Sarah, we've reported that Masayoshi's son was actually in Riyadh and met with the Crown Prince, but he has stayed away from the actual conference.
Right.
I mean, what is the significance of this? We know he has a close relationship with the Crown Prince.
Right. So he essentially dropped out in a much more gentle way compared to some of the other business leaders who left. It was sort of a compromise. He went to Riyadh, essentially met with the Crown Prince and other Saudi officials on the sidelines of the conference, but didn't go to the conference itself. However, a lot of SoftBank execs remain at the conference.
Now, Ray, we've seen many top executives opt to stay away from the conference, but have continued business relationships with Saudi Arabia. Do you think that the turn of events could fundamentally change the relationship between foreign businesses and Saudi Arabia, or do you think it will eventually be business as usual?
You know, I think the money is too hard for people to turn away. And so I think people were hoping that this would blow over. And when it didn't blow over and the facts got worse, people got scared. A lot of the startups, as you know, have very progressive viewpoints. And to have this type of money taint or impact their perspective of what's going on is a challenge. But the double-edged sword is for Saudi Arabia to move out and to progress, they have to make these types of investments. So I think it's going to be a lot of difficult decisions for a lot of startup entrepreneurs and for a lot of the investors.
And Sarah, given the intense pressure and scrutiny, what are the chances that SoftBank will actually go elsewhere hunting for the $45 billion for the next fund?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to say at this point, and it'll be interesting to see if an argument gets made. Much has happened with China, that SoftBank can perhaps influence Saudi Arabia somehow from within and help it become more progressive in certain ways. So I think a lot of people will be starting to try to tell a different story about Saudi Arabia.
And Ray, it's worth mentioning that Saudi Arabia has a very long track record of investing in the technology industry, and that it also has a very long track record of human rights violations. So is a result of this going to cause entrepreneurs and startups to look more critically at where their money is coming from, especially if it's Saudi Arabia?
I think we're going to see a transformation in Saudi Arabia long term. I think this is a lesson learned from MBS as well as for the Saudi government to realize that their actions have a huge impact around the world. And investors are going to take note to see what type of ethical reforms may take place in terms of how not only how Saudi's actions affect their investment thesis, but also how those actions affect investors' perceptions about doing business in Saudi Arabia.
And Sarah, you've been speaking with venture capitalists and startups. What's the sentiment you're getting from them? Is there any instance of a startup turning away money from SoftBank?
I've heard there's actually a startup that's currently weighing a term sheet from SoftBank, and because of these allegations, a term sheet that they probably would have accepted without too much thought, they're really wondering whether to take the money or not. And I think more broadly, startups are going to start asking more questions about the investors that their own venture capital investors have, and that really hasn't been the case previously.
And Ray, we're seeing tech employees have a lot more influence over their employers. Just one example is the Google protests that caused Google to not renew a defense contract. So do you think that we might see some sort of revolt within companies that choose to take money from certain sources that are deemed unethical?
We definitely see that. We're here in Half Moon Bay at a conference, and literally the top conversation was, do we accept money from countries that might not have the same values or same views on human rights or ethics? And that was a big discussion today, really about what happens. And I think you'll see that. And I think, you know, there are a couple companies actually in play with SoftBank as well, as Sarah was saying. They are seriously evaluating the term sheets. They're wondering if they can take that money. They're wondering if they can put some conditions on behavior as to what to do with that money. So I think we're going to see that. And the other piece we may see, too, is with SoftBank, whether they use the last piece of that vision fund. There's about 10 to 15 billion in that they might just actually say, hey, that's just an excess expense and not recognize that revenue for that fund. So we may see some actions like that to soften the blow.
And Sarah, you've reported on other venture funds like Sequoia raising billions and billions to compete with SoftBank. So could this potentially benefit companies, funds like Sequoia, in terms of competing with SoftBank for later stage deals?
Absolutely. It's just one more piece of ammunition those other firms will have now. Then they often talk about their investors and say, hey, we're helping hospitals, we're helping college endowments, and they might not want to say who you're helping if you take money from SoftBank, but that understanding will implicitly be there, that maybe you're helping people you don't want to help.
And Ray, how do you think this could impact the overall tech ecosystem? You know, money from sources like Saudi Arabia have come flooding into Silicon Valley. It's arguably raised valuations. Could this, you know, cause valuations to actually come down and make it a chiller ecosystem for funding?
I think it could change the ecosystem play, and I think it's important to see that impact, because the $100 billion Vision Fund and the 5 other ones that Masayoshi's son was thinking about creating, those are all, at risk at the moment, as people think about whether they will accept that money, as well as the perception of that fund. So I think it's going to be up to MBS and Saudi Arabia to actually put out a statement to express what they're going to do going forward, so that there's at least confidence. I'm sure those were some of those discussions that happened on the side in those private meetings about what can we do to actually either change behaviors or look and relook at the investment profile for these funds.